Under a sky the color of faded silver, the small western town lay hushed, as though the desert itself had drawn a heavy breath and refused to let it go. Dust slid across the main street in restless waves, catching on wagon wheels long forgotten, swirling around the crooked sign of the saloon that clinked against its chain with every flick of the wind. Nothing moved. No laughter, no boots striking against wood, except for a lone woman standing beneath the mercantile porch, her arms folded tight across her chest. Her presence was like a solitary flame against the grey day, proud, unyielding, yet fragile in the way flames bend when the wind insists. She carried silence like a weapon, the kind of silence earned from years of being judged, whispered about, and left behind. Her life had shrunk to the fragile walls of a cabin on the edge of town, a cabin that leaned against storms the way she leaned against her own pain, quietly, stubbornly, refusing to fall. She lived on scraps, coins traded for patched clothes, bruised vegetables, or the occasional sack of flour. The townsfolk knew her story, though they spoke of it in low tones, how her husband had squandered every acre of land on whiskey, how he had vanished without farewell, leaving her with debts that burned her name deeper than any brand. Yet she stayed, clinging to the ground that had been both her prison and her only anchor. Healing, if such a word could still belong to her, meant learning to live in a place where every glance might cut and every shadow might threaten. That morning she felt the air shift, the way one feels a storm approaching before clouds appear. A rider emerged from the horizon, his figure a wavering silhouette etched in sunlight and dust. With each hoofbeat, the silence of the street seemed to tighten. He was no polished ranch hand. His clothes hung with the weight of travel. The revolver at his side sat low as though it had been drawn more than once, and his horse carried the wear of long miles under unforgiving skies. His arrival was not merely a presence, it was a question written in flesh and dust, a question the town itself seemed afraid to answer. Her heart hammered, though her face betrayed nothing. Strangers seldom brought peace. They carried trouble folded into saddlebags, debts written on their skin, secrets buried in their silence. She had seen them before, men who spoke with smirks, who mistook loneliness for invitation, who thought a woman alone was nothing but ground left open for the taking. She would not yield to that again. Pride braced her spine, sharpened her voice into a blade. When the rider drew close to the pump, she cut the silence with words that struck like iron, bold, unflinching, daring him to reveal his nature. He did not laugh, did not sneer, did not take offense as others would have. Instead, he bowed his head, pulled water from the pump, and offered the bucket to her first. The gesture was plain, quiet, but it unsettled her more than mockery ever could. Healing was never expected from a stranger's hand, yet in that simple act she felt a flicker of something she had long forgotten, the possibility that not every man came with hunger in his eyes. He draped his coat across her shoulders when the desert wind turned sharp. She almost refused, the word rising hot in her throat, but the weight of the coat was steady, and it carried not demand but a silent respect. She told herself she owed him nothing. Yet when he fixed his gaze on the saloon where two men leered at her, then turned away without feeding their laughter, she understood he carried his own ghosts. And perhaps, for the first time in many months, she did not feel entirely defenseless. When she finally gestured down the dirt path that led toward her cabin, her voice was steady but softer than she intended. "If you're looking for a place to sit out the night, "Follow." He nodded, saying nothing, but his silence spoke more than words. They walked side by side, not close, but not distant either. Each carried their own unspoken fears, the fear of trusting, the fear of being betrayed again, the fear of needing someone after swearing never to. And yet, the path beneath their boots seemed to bind them in its quiet rhythm. When the cabin came into view, slouched against the earth but still standing, she crossed her arms, waiting for judgment. None came. Instead, he pressed his hand against the broken door and bent to mend it with a bent nail and wire, as though repairing it were not just labor, but a language of its own. The gesture rippled through her chest like water striking dry stone. For so long she had expected men to break what she had left. But this stranger built instead, silently, carefully, without asking for payment. In the glow of that small act, something within her loosened, though she kept her eyes sharp to hide it. He ate the thin beans she shared without complaint, rinsed his bowl at the pump without prompting, and sat outside her porch with a rifle laid across his knees, guarding the night without asking why. Sleep eluded her. Yet as dawn broke, she stepped outside and saw him still there, hat brim low, eyes steady on the horizon. She wanted to ask why he had stayed, why he had not demanded more, why he watched over a house that was not his. The words faltered on her tongue, but the answer glimmered in the silence between them. He, too, was weary of moving. He, too, carried scars invisible yet heavy. And in the quiet of the morning light, the fragile truth stretched between them. Two broken lives had collided in this barren corner of the world, and perhaps, if trust could be coaxed like fire from flint, neither would have to walk alone any more. The story was only beginning, its promise hidden in every glance, every gesture, every unspoken question. Like the cabin that leaned but did not fall, their hearts held room for repair, for strength, for a love that might one day feel less like survival and more like healing. And if this tale stirs something warm in your own heart, I gently invite you to linger a little longer. Leave your thoughts in a comment. Share your feelings with others, and if you find comfort in these words, let your support be known with a like or a quiet subscription. Even the smallest gestures, like the stranger's coat on her shoulders, can carry light across long and weary nights. Together, we can keep this fire alive. And so the morning sun rose higher, drawing their shadows long across the dirt path, carrying them into the next chapter of a story neither of them had expected, but both had quietly needed. The rider who had entered her life like a shadow, cast long against the dust, did not vanish at the first night's edge. He remained, quiet as a stone set in the current, his presence changing the flow without demanding to be noticed. The morning after she allowed him to sit watch on her porch, she stepped outside with caution balanced against gratitude. He had not moved from his place all night. His rifle lay across his knees, his hat tilted forward to break the chill, but his eyes were clear, awake, as if weariness had been held back by sheer will. She studied him, the way one studies a stranger who might hold danger or safety in equal measure. He looked at her only long enough to nod once, and in that small gesture she felt the earth shift, subtle but undeniable. Her days, once predictable in their hardship, began to bend toward a different shape with him near. He fixed the rope at the well so it no longer threatened to snap, tightened the hinge on the broken door, brushed the horse that carried her small burdens to town. Each act was done without demand, each gesture plain and steady, as though he had made a vow to himself not to take more than he gave. She found her chest loosening in ways she could not explain. For so long she had been braced against loss, against intrusion, against the weight of being seen as weak. Now she began to see what healing might look like, not as some miracle delivered by dawn, but as the steady rhythm of hands making broken things whole again. At first she resisted. When he set his coat across her shoulders in the cool of evening, pride rose sharp in her throat. But the truth was, the desert cut cruel once the sun fell, and warmth was no small mercy. She kept her chin high, but she let the fabric rest against her skin. When he took his portion of beans without complaint, rinsing the bowl clean at the pump before setting it aside, she felt unsettled by the absence of greed. She had grown used to men who took, to men who spoke until her silence had no room. His quiet carried another kind of weight, respect. The town noticed, of course. Whispers followed her each time she walked its narrow street, now multiplied by the presence of a stranger at her side. The two men who leaned at the saloon rail smirked as if they understood more than they did, their voices low, but their eyes cutting sharp. She hated the sting of those stares, hated the familiar shame that pressed hot against her chest. But when the cowboy walked past them without answering, without feeding their laughter, she felt a new steadiness rise in her. Silence, she realized, could be a shield when wielded by someone who knew how not to let the world's noise take root. The cabin bore his mark in small ways that became impossible to ignore. A door that once sagged now swung straight. A fence that once leaned now stood against the wind. The yard, though still scarred and bare, no longer looked abandoned. She caught herself noticing these things in the evenings, when the lamp glowed against patched curtains, when the coyote's call drifted distant instead of near. She began to sleep deeper, not because fear had vanished, but because it no longer held the same dominion. His watch on the porch carried a promise, one he had never spoken aloud, but she heard all the same. "You are not alone tonight." One evening, after she had stretched oats into a thin supper and placed the bowls before them both, she dared to ask the question that had sat in her chest since the day he appeared. "Why here?" she asked, her voice steady, her eyes fixed on the scarred table between them. He did not answer right away, as though he weighed the truth against what she might bear. Finally he said, "The horse needed rest, and I've been moving long enough." The words were simple, but beneath them lay a confession, that running had not saved him, that he carried debts not only written on paper, but carved into memory. She studied him in that moment, and something softened inside her. Different burdens, yes, but the same shape of weariness. The night deepened, and the desert wind pressed against the cabin walls, like a reminder of all they had survived separately. She folded her arms, stared at the lamp, and let herself believe, just for a moment, that perhaps together they might survive differently. Healing was not found in grand gestures. It was here, in the ordinary. 2 bowls on a table, a door that closed without protest, a silence that no longer threatened but steadied. Outside, the coyotes sang again, but she did not flinch. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to rest, knowing he would keep the watch. And as dawn drew near, with pale light spreading over the ridge, the story of their 2 wounded lives began to thread into one, carrying them forward into whatever waited beyond the horizon. The days began to fall into a rhythm neither of them dared to name. Each sunrise painted the land in pale gold, the desert stretching endless and unbroken, yet the cabin stood firmer with every nail driven, every fence post cut, every gesture that passed quietly between them. He rose early, moving with the steady purpose of a man who had lived too long in motion, but now, here, his hands lingered on work that was not his own. He mended the rope at the well until it pulled clean and strong, checked the hooves of his horse with the patience of someone who understood fragility, and worked the land with sweat darkening his shirt until the soil seemed to acknowledge his presence. She moved beside him, sleeves rolled, hammering wood, planting beans in shallow rows, her body bearing blisters, yet her spirit carrying a lightness she had not felt in years. Silence lived between them, but it no longer pressed like stone. Instead, it flowed like a stream, gentle, healing, a place where their wounds could rest. One evening the sky turned the color of bruised lilac, and the weight of unspoken truths pressed against the walls of the cabin as heavy as the desert night. She sat by the lamp, hands folded, and finally let words escape that she had carried too long. She spoke of the man who had once promised her love, who had bartered away firewood for whiskey, who had left her with debts and bruises, scars both seen and hidden. Her voice wavered, but she did not look away, as though daring him to judge her, to pity her, to confirm the shame the town had whispered behind her back. But he did not. He sat forward, elbows on his knees, listening with the steady patience of a man who knew that silence could be an answer kinder than words. When she fell quiet, his own story followed. His brother buried beneath a nameless ridge, the foreman he owed, the cattle drive that ended in blood, the debts that chased him across the land. He did not cloak his past in excuses, nor did he soften it for her ears. He gave it plain, rough, and unvarnished, as though offering her his scars without demand. In that exchange, something shifted. Their burdens, though different, weighed the same, and they recognized in each other the weary strength of those who had endured too much but had not yet surrendered. Healing is often slow, a tender thread stitched through torn cloth. But in that moment their lives became entwined by the quiet understanding that neither was entirely alone anymore. She felt the hardness of her chest ease as she realized his silence was not distance but care, a way of protecting the fragile space they were building together. Nights stretched deeper, but fear no longer gripped her as it once had. Coyotes called beyond the ridge, storms pressed against the roof, but he was always there, rifle across his knees, his stillness wrapping her home in a shield stronger than any bolt on the door. One storm broke so wild that rain rattled against the patched tin and wind clawed at the walls as though it meant to tear the cabin apart. She braced herself. Memories of other nights when fists and shouts had battered her heart, rising like ghosts. But this time, when the walls shook, she did not face it alone. He climbed the roof in driving rain, hammering wire and nails into sheets that screamed against the gale, his hands steady even as lightning cracked the sky. She held lanterns low, moved jars from shelves, pressed her weight against the door as the storm clawed at the cabin. And when he returned, soaked through but breathing steady, their eyes met in the fragile glow of the flame, and for the first time she felt the storm break not only outside but within her chest. At dawn, when the land lay scarred with mud, but the cabin still stood, she stepped barefoot onto the porch and breathed air sharp with sweetness. He stood beside the horse, brushing rain from its flank, and when his gaze lifted to hers, it carried something softer than she had yet seen on his face, a tired smile, fleeting but real. The storm had not broken them. It had welded something stronger between them. Healing, she thought, was not always about forgetting the pain, but about finding someone who would stand through the storm with you until the sky cleared. When word came from the marshal that the claim against her land was worthless and that the man who threatened her would face his own reckoning, she felt her shoulders straighten for the first time in years. The ground beneath her, once a weight of shame, became hers again, not only because the law said so, but because she had chosen to stay, to fight, to endure. And he, the drifter who had arrived with silence heavy on his back, did not leave when the danger passed. She looked at him, the man who had fixed her door, her fence, her faith, and understood the choice waiting between them. "You could keep moving," she said one evening, her voice low but steady. "Or you could stay." His eyes travelled over the cabin, the yard, the fence line they had mended together. Then he looked back at her, and his answer came simple, almost gentle. "I'm tired of moving. If you'll have me, I'll stay." Relief rose in her chest like dawn breaking across the flats, and for once she did not fight it. She nodded, unable to say more, but knowing that gesture was enough. From that day, the rhythm of their lives shifted into something that carried hope. He found part-time work in town, honest pay untainted by debts, and she traded her washing for hens whose soft clucking filled the yard with a sound like comfort. Together they carved initials into the doorframe, quiet and private, their mark upon the world not for others to see, but for themselves to remember. At dusk they walked the fence line, shoulder brushing against shoulder, silence humming with warmth. When the air turned cold, he set his coat across her shoulders, and this time she did not refuse. Instead, she leaned against him, forehead resting briefly against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath the rough fabric. The cabin, once only a place of survival, became a home where warmth bloomed in small acts, coffee brewed strong enough to carry them through tired mornings, a lamp burning steady without wind slipping through cracks, laughter, soft, tentative but real, breaking the silence of nights. The Wild West remained harsh, unforgiving, but within the walls they had rebuilt. Love took root, not as sudden fire, but as steady flame. It was healing in its purest form, the kind that mends without erasing scars, the kind that turns broken ground into a place worth keeping. And as the lantern's glow painted the cabin in amber light, she knew she had found not only safety, but something rarer still, a love born from endurance, carried by silence, and made unshakable by storms. The days stretched forward with promise, the desert wide and unyielding, but the two of them now stood together, no longer drifting, no longer waiting for the world to break them. Their story, fragile and beautiful, had only just begun. The days that followed wrapped themselves in a strange stillness, the kind that hummed not with emptiness, but with a quiet rhythm that slowly began to feel like belonging. Morning light stretched pale across the desert, glinting on the repaired glass of her cabin window, and she found herself pausing longer at the threshold before stepping outside, as though she could not quite believe the place was hers again. Hers to keep, hers to protect, hers to fill with something more than survival. He was already there each morning, sleeves rolled, the lines of his shoulders bent toward labor, his hands moving with the calm steadiness of a man who had long carried burdens and now chose to set them down in work that mattered. His silence did not weigh her down anymore. It felt like a balm, a kind of healing presence that allowed her to breathe without fear of judgment. She watched him carve fence posts, split logs, tend the horse with quiet patience, and something within her softened each time she saw how naturally his hands repaired what had been broken for too long. She had lived months expecting only loss, every board sagging a reminder of what had been taken from her, but now each nail he drove into the wood seemed to hammer back a piece of her faith. Healing did not roar through her life like thunder. It crept in gently, disguised as the simple strength of another pair of hands, refusing to let her world fall apart. She began to notice how their silences changed, less guarded, more comfortable, as though their unspoken pain recognized itself in the other and chose not to wound. At night, when the lamp burned low, the weight of the desert pressed in around the cabin. Coyotes called from the ridge, and the wind whispered against the patched roof, but she no longer listened with dread. Instead, she listened for the steady sound of his boots on the porch, for the soft scrape of his rifle as he shifted it across his knees, for the quiet breath that reminded her she was not entirely alone. For the first time in years, she allowed her body to loosen against the quilt, sleep catching her in fragile threads. Outside, he remained, a sentinel, not because she demanded it, but because he had chosen to stay. That choice alone wove warmth into the darkness. One evening, after a long day of work that left their hands raw and their backs aching, she sat at the table, eyes on the scarred wood, and spoke words she had not thought she would ever let free. She told him of her husband, the broken promises, the empty bottles, the debts written into her name, the nights when the bruises ached deeper than hunger. She spoke without tears, her voice steady, though her chest carried the weight of old wounds. She braced herself for pity, for the sharpness of judgment, but it never came. He listened, his gaze steady, his face unchanged, as though he understood too well the shape of that pain. When her words fell silent, he spoke in turn, his voice low and rough, confessing his own story, his brother buried under a ridge with no name, the debts to a foreman that had chased him across state lines, the fights that had carved scars into his skin. He offered his past not as an excuse, but as truth, plain and unvarnished, a raw gift of trust. That night, something unspoken bound them closer. Their wounds, though carved in different ways, carried the same ache, and in the sharing of them, the silence between became something gentler. She felt the edges of her heart, so long braced against hurt, begin to ease. Healing is not always soft. Sometimes it is forged in the courage to sit with someone else's pain without turning away. They did that for each other, and in doing so, a fragile foundation began to rise beneath their feet. But the desert has its own way of testing what stands. Not long after, hooves thundered down the path, and a rider drew up at the fence, his voice carrying the arrogance of men who thought ink on paper could erase a life. He threw down a claim, a debt her vanished husband had scrawled, declaring that the cabin and the land were not hers. Her chest seized with shame, the old panic of being stripped of everything she had clung to. Yet before the fear could drown her, he stepped forward, his voice calm and steady as iron, calling the paper what it was, worthless. No seal, no record, no law behind it, just empty threats. The rider faltered, his smirk shrinking as silence heavier than bullets met him. She leaned against the porch post, her legs weak, but for once she did not face the weight alone. He folded the paper and placed it beneath the heavy kettle, as though even false debts had no power here anymore. His words were not promises, but they were truth, and truth gave her strength. That night, the lamp's glow flickered against the cabin walls while he cleaned his rifle, and she sat across from him, fingers tracing the rim of an empty cup. She wanted to ask why he stayed, why he guarded a home that was not his, why he gave without asking. The words clung to her throat, but she did not speak them. Instead, she poured the last of the thin coffee, set it before him, and in his quiet nod of thanks, she felt her heart steady. Trust was fragile, dangerous, but she could no longer deny it was taking root between them. The next morning brought a clarity she had not expected. The marshal's verdict confirmed what she already knew. The claim was nothing but fraud. Her land was hers, and no man's lie could take it. As she stepped back into the sunlight, the town's whispers cutting at her, she walked taller, the shawl pulled tight, not as armor, but as a banner. Beside her, he carried lumber and nails without a word, and together they built back what had sagged too long. Each board, each pane of glass, each fence post became proof not only that the cabin still stood, but that her life, too, was no longer crumbling. And through it all, their bond grew quiet and strong. She began to notice the gentler things, the way he brushed his horse with a tenderness that spoke of loss, the way he set his coat across her shoulders before she asked, the way his silence wrapped around her like a shield. She had lived for so long expecting only to be broken again, yet now she discovered what it felt like to be held, not in hands, but in presence, in patience, in the simple grace of being seen. Healing came in these small, steady ways, like dawn creeping across the desert. When dusk settled one evening, and the lantern burned warm against the walls, she turned to him, with a heart steady enough to speak what she once thought impossible. "You could keep moving," she said softly, "or you could stay." His eyes lingered on the cabin, the fence, the yard now filled with hens clucking softly, before he looked back at her. His answer was simple, but it struck like a vow. "I'm tired of moving. If you'll have me, I'll stay." Relief welled in her chest, fierce and fragile, and for once she did not fight it. She nodded, and in that nod the future began. From that moment, their days grew into something warmer, something almost tender. He worked part-time in town, earning honest wages, while she traded her labor for life that filled the yard with sound and movement. They carved their initials into the doorframe, private and hidden, a secret mark of what they were building together. At night, she leaned against him longer, forehead pressed to his chest, and let herself breathe in the steadiness of his heart. The cabin, once a place of ghosts, now pulsed with life, and in its humble glow they discovered love, quiet, enduring, healing. The desert did not grow softer, but they did not face it alone. Each sunrise was no longer just another day to survive. It was another day to share, to build, to believe. And as the stars gathered overhead, their silence turned into the language of something deeper, the promise that broken souls, stitched together with patience and trust, could create a life stronger than any storm. The mornings began to hum with a rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat, steady, reliable, soft in its constancy. Dawn spilled pale light across the ridges, the sky carrying the sweetness of cool air before the desert heat pressed down again, and she found herself rising with less weight pressing her chest. For years the day had always started with dread, the counting of coins too few, the measuring of flour too thin, the ache of knowing every choice could end with something else lost. But now, when she stepped outside with her shawl tight across her shoulders, she saw him already at work, sleeves rolled, his figure bent over the earth or the fence line, as though the land itself had been waiting for his hands. His presence was not loud, not demanding. It was steady, like a balm laid over wounds she had carried too long, a healing rhythm that allowed her heart to begin trusting the shape of a future. The cabin bore the marks of his touch everywhere. The roof no longer whistled with wind at night. The new pane of glass held back the cold, its clarity like a promise that storms could be endured without breaking everything. The fence posts stood straight. The chicken coop now had a door, and the well rope no longer frayed in her hands. Each repair stitched a thread of hope through her chest, and she felt herself loosening in ways that frightened her almost as much as they comforted. She caught herself humming sometimes as she stirred oats, her voice low, cracked from disuse, but alive. And at dusk, when the land exhaled its heat and the coyotes called from far ridges, she would glance at him sitting on the porch with his rifle across his knees, and the sight would fill her chest with something she had not let herself believe in for years: safety. Their days unfolded in quiet companionship, a language woven not of words, but of gestures. He split logs, she stacked them. He drove posts, she hammered nails. Their silences shifted from guarded to companionable, from heavy to warm. Sometimes she would catch herself watching the way his hands moved with the calm patience of someone who had learned that rushing only led to ruin. Other times she would find his eyes on her, steady but never pressing, as though he too found healing in simply knowing another soul stood nearby. The distance that had once stretched between them slowly thinned, until it felt as though they moved with the same rhythm, two currents flowing side by side. One evening, as the last light burned orange across the horizon, she finally let her voice break the silence. She spoke of the nights when fear had been her only companion, when the sound of boots outside her door had meant dread rather than comfort. She told him. The mornings kept arriving like soft assurances, laid one upon another, until the fear that used to greet her at first light began to loosen its grip. The window he'd fitted held the dawn the way good glass holds water, clear, still, honest. And she often stood in its square of brightness with a mug between her palms, letting warmth settle into places that had known too much cold. Outside, he moved with that quiet steadiness that had become the rhythm of the yard, drawing water, checking the rails, palming the horse's muzzle with a patience that seemed to unspool time itself. She learned the sound of his work, the creak of leather, the low rasp of a file on metal, the measured thud of a mallet, and her body, once braced against every noise, began to read those sounds like lullabies. He had started calling the hens by names she would never admit made her smile: Maple, Pepper, and Juniper, the last of which insisted on roosting high where the sunrise found her first. When he walked past, the birds made quick little songs, and he answered without words, the corners of his mouth bending as if music could be held without being made. She found herself humming as she sifted flour, a tune from childhood whose words she'd forgotten, carried now only as a feeling. and once, catching the humming leave her, she froze. He glanced in from the porch, a question only in his eyes. Heat flushed her face, as though joy were something improper. He tipped his hat and looked back out at the fence, respectful of the fragile, everyday miracles that did not need naming. The townspeople kept their distance as they always had, but distance did not burn as it once did. She and he rode in together when they must, with a list in her shawl and exact coins counted, the world's hardness balanced by the simple relief of another pair of hands beneath what she carried. She saw the way the livery owner took to him, how quickly honest work made a place for a man who didn't gossip or drink his wages, and soon the livery found in him a reliable set of shoulders. They paid him at week's end, half in coin, half in oats and spare lumber, and he returned to the cabin with those gifts, not like a victor with plunder, but like a man bringing home the ordinary mercy of enough. On a windless afternoon, he asked her if she'd ever learned to ride for pleasure rather than necessity. Her answer, "Pleasure has been rationed here," was sharper than she intended, but he took no offence. He saddled the quieter horse, cinched her shawl tighter, and coaxed her into the saddle by teaching her where to place the ball of her foot, how to gather the reins without strangling nerves or leather. The first steps felt ungainly. The land swayed under her, and an old panic rose the way a bruise remembers touch. He kept one hand to the bridle, walking beside her, his voice low enough to calm the animal, lower still to steady the rider. "Breathe with him," he said. "Let your breath be the law he can keep." The horse obeyed the softness in his tone. She matched that rhythm almost by accident. Inhale, exhale, and for 3 slow circuits round the yard, she believed she could be the kind of woman who did not merely endure the ride, but enjoyed it. When she slid down, her legs trembled. He pretended not to notice. He only checked the girth again and murmured, for the horse's sake and hers, "Good. That's good." Their evenings softened in other ways, too. She had a way with needles and cloth that made practical beauty from scraps, and she began to cut pieces from a shirt beyond mending, from a flour sack too thin for storing grain, from the hem of a skirt no longer fit for town. The quilt grew across the table like a field tilled into pattern. He watched her work, fingers quick and precise, and once or twice she felt his gaze falter at a memory far back in his mind. Finally, he said it. His brother's coat, how he had patched it with clumsy thread the winter before the ground found him. She pressed a square into his palm, a small piece of blue calico, and said only, "Add this." He did. The stitch was crooked, but she treasured the flaw like the first handwriting of a child. When he nicked his hand on a wire looped meanly under a rail, she brought a basin to the porch and set it beside him with salt to clean the wound. He hissed through his teeth, trying to make light of the pain. She ignored the bravado. She cupped his wrist with a gentleness as practical as it was tender, and washed the cut with the patience she gave to every task worth doing. "Hold still," she said, and he stilled, the whole world seeming to narrow to the warmth of her fingers and the coolness of water. She wrapped a strip torn from a worn petticoat round the injury, tied it snug, and left her hand there half a beat longer than need demanded. When she let go, he flexed his fingers, surprise crossing his face, not at the pain, but at the way her care had dulled it. Healing worked like that, she thought, not always erasing hurt, but changing the way hurt spoke inside the body. Slowly, the house gave back to them what they gave to it. She lined the shelf with paper neatly, each jar labeled in the small script she had learned from a thrifted primer long ago. He watched the letters form and confessed he could sign his name and read the simple out-loud words the world required, but lines bunched together still made him feel like a trespasser in someone else's field. She fetched the primer without a speech and placed it on the table. On a night when the wind had closed the valley in and the lamp threw an amber pool over their hands, he traced letters with the blunt pencil she had kept short to make it last. "Ah," he said, the letter carved sturdier than necessary. "Ah, for your brother," she answered. He lowered his eyes, and the hush that followed did not ache as it once had. The ache in it made space for gentleness. There were days the past returned as if summoned by the scent of rain or the press of an evening silence. When a knock came on the door too late and too proud, fear flashed through her like lightning, rooting her to the floor. He stood without haste, put a palm to the small of her back, a steady human anchor, and said, "I've got it." The visitor turned out to be a ranch hand with the wrong house and the right apology, but the shakes in her arms remained long after his horse clattered away. He stoked the stove until its red heart steadied. He set a kettle to whisper. He did not tell her to be brave. He did not tell her it was nothing. He only pressed a cup into her hands and sat near enough for his presence to be felt without crowding the air. Her breathing found his again. The tremor loosened. Later she touched the doorframe and whispered a name only she and the wood needed to hear. Home. Once, walking the fence line at dusk, he told her about a sky somewhere south where storms stacked on mountains like folded blankets, heavy and beautiful, and how he had slept under their weight, unafraid. She told him about a spring her mother had favored, toward the wash where wild mint grew low and fragrant, and how a single leaf between the fingers could make a life feel kinder. He listened as if mint were a miracle he'd never learned to see. The next day, he brought home a handful of green he'd found 2 ridges over and set it on the table with a shyness that made him look younger than any number could. They crushed a leaf together and breathed its clean brightness like medicine. The marshal's visits stopped because they no longer needed him, and in that absence the town found some other thing to talk about. A woman who had been cold before pressed a loaf of coarse bread into her hands with a shrug that worked harder than the gift. A boy from the livery brought spare nails in a tin and left them by the pump with his name scrawled bravely on the lid. Trust did not bloom all at once. It crept along the edges like prairie grass, reclaiming a patch of ground left bare. She knew enough not to lean on it. She knew enough to appreciate the soft edges it laid around hard days. As harvest brightness gilded the brush and nights drew stingingly clean, the quilt grew heavy enough to warm too. Sometimes they sat with it over their legs at the table, reading aloud in fits and starts, him learning the weight of syllables, her offering patience like a match cupped in wind, until the room felt full of something both had missed without knowing the name. She began saving little lines from scripture and scraps of songs, pinning them on a nail near the door, words to lift and settle the spirit on mornings when gloom came too soon. He began making small things from wood, knife handles that fit the palm as if the palm had shaped them, a spoon carved smooth as river stone. One of those spoons became her favorite, not because it was the prettiest, but because the handle wore the notch his thumb had left. It felt like touching his work and his hand at once. On the first truly cold evening, he took a restless turn outside, and she watched him from the window, gathering himself against a choice he had not yet named. When he came in, he closed the door carefully, as if doors could remember how they were treated, and stood with his hat in his hands. "If anyone comes asking," he said, not looking up, "about a foreman in New Mexico and a debt old enough to grow a beard, if it finds me here—" He paused, then raised his eyes. "I'll face it square. I won't let it spill into your life." She considered him a long moment. The quilt pooled at her waist. The lamp burned steady. "It already belongs to both of us," she said at last, simple as setting bread on a table. "That's what choosing means." The relief that washed his face did not make him smaller. It opened him, like heat unlocks the scent of cedar. He swallowed, nodded once, and set his hat on its peg, like a man who had been given permission to arrive. They shared the quiet gratitude of that night with deliberate care. No feast, no grand vows, just 2 bowls of broth, 2 pairs of hands that had learned to fit work to need, 2 souls bedding down under a quilt sewn from left-behinds and beginnings. The wind worried the eaves and then lost interest. Coyotes trailed their thin songs along the ridge and fell silent. The horse shifted in the corral, and the fence held. A lantern on the table burned low enough to be believed. Later, when sleep had nearly taken her, the old ghost brushed by, the memory of footsteps she had once feared, the reflex to reach for a knife she no longer needed. He woke instantly, not with the panic of a man hunted, but with the readiness of a man who knows what it is to be called to gentleness in the dark. He didn't speak. He reached for her hand and placed it over his heart, the steady rhythm offering a lesson older than language. "I am here." Her breath counted that rhythm until panic could not multiply in its presence. In the morning she brewed coffee and crushed mint into the cups for brightness, and he grinned at the strange combination as if life itself had invented a new way to be kind. The week turned again, bringing the small errands that set a life upright: lamp oil to fetch, a broken stirrup to mend, a list to write with a pencil worn down to a stub. She laced her boots and pulled on the shawl he favoured for her, the one mended at the shoulder with thread so close to the original colour it needed light to show. At the threshold they paused by habit, eyes brushing the yard for anything out of place. That was when she saw it. A scrap of paper tucked neatly beneath a stone on the porch rail, anchored so the wind could not make off with the message meant for them. He stepped forward, lifted the stone, and smoothed the paper against his palm. It was not the coarse cheapness of a conman's claim, nor the refined officialness of a marshal's notice. The script was careful, the edges even, the ink a dark, measured line. He read the first sentence under his breath, and she watched his face as it changed shape, astonishment, then something like recognition, then the set steadiness he wore for difficult work. He handed it to her without comment, and she read the same careful hand. A name from his past, a place, a single request for a meeting at the edge of town where the cottonwoods held their leaves longer than they should. No threats, no debts named outright. Only, "I believe we can settle this with honor." The word honor caught in her chest like a thorn and a blessing, both at once. He looked to her, not for permission, but for the truth they had chosen to share. She folded the paper, slid it into the pocket sewn deep in her skirt, and said, "Then we'll go." He started to protest, habit, fear, the good reflex to shield, but she placed her fingers at his wrist and felt the pulse that had steadied her in so many midnights. "We go," she repeated, with the calm of a woman who had learned there is healing in walking toward what once hunted you. His shoulders lowered. The fight left not as surrender, but as trust. They stepped into daylight together. The fence line threw long shadows like lines drawn to the horizon. The hens bobbed their little heads and muttered hopes only they could understand. The horse flicked an ear and waited for instruction. She took the folded paper from her pocket, pressed it flat once more, and slid it under the lamp on the table as one sets down a promise. Then she tied her shawl, and he shrugged into his coat. And the door, mended, steady, theirs, swung shut with the sound of a home that would still be there when they returned. The path to the cottonwoods would be quiet, and long enough for fears to speak and be answered, for memories to rise and be met, for the word honor to find its true size between them. The wind lifted as if to test their resolve, and then, respectful, fell away. And though the desert remained what it had always been, wide, indifferent, honest, they walked side by side with a warmth between them that felt like shelter carried, like a lantern cupped against night. They left the porch with the paper tucked under the lamp and the door closing gently behind them, as if the house itself trusted their return. Morning had sharpened into a steady light. The cottonwoods could be seen from the ridge, holding on to their green with a stubbornness she admired. The path there was familiar in part and new in part, familiar to her feet, new in what it asked of her heart. Wind tugged at her shawl, then settled, a restless child deciding to behave. He walked a half-step to the outside, an old habit of making space for danger that might come from the open, and she let him keep that place, not as concession, but as a kind of grace. They spoke little, not because there was nothing to say, but because the words inside them were being measured, weighed, chosen with care. When they did speak, it was to notice useful things, the ground still soft from last week's storm, and therefore kind to hooves, a line of quail prints quick across the wash, the way sunlight slipped in blades through cottonwood leaves, making a pattern like lace on the dirt. The nearness of his shoulder steadied her more than any strategy could have. She could feel how his breathing altered when his thoughts ran toward danger, how each exhale lengthened as if he meant to tame whatever rose in him. Her own breath fell into step with that rhythm. Healing, she thought, might be as simple and as hard as teaching the body to count with kindness. They reached the first of the cottonwoods and paused in its shade. The land there smelled faintly of damp earth and old leaves, a different kind of comfort than the clean dryness of sage. He touched the trunk with the back of his fingers, the way someone greets a house of worship without making a show of it. Across the clearing, a man waited on a grey horse that looked well-fed and older than its rider. He had the careful posture of someone used to being listened to, a neat hat, a coat that fit him because he had taken care to fit into it, and eyes that scanned the ground not for advantage but for truth. He raised a hand, palm open, and did not reach for the rifle that rested casually in the scabbard. "Foreman?" the cowboy asked, voice low, not a challenge but a naming. The man nodded once. Lines around his mouth told of years spent arguing with weather and numbers, not just with men. He swung down with a stiffness that spoke of long rides and longer seasons. "I wrote because talk in a town outruns the horse that starts it," the foreman said. "I'd rather words ride on their own legs." He glanced at her then, not over her, not past her, but to her, and tipped his hat. "Mom." The respect was a small thing and a large thing. She returned the nod and felt some knot she hadn't named loosen. "We can stand here," the cowboy said, measuring the space, the open, the sky. The foreman agreed with a look that said, "I prefer daylight to any room where shadows choose sides." He took a folded paper from his coat. This paper bore the unhurried hand of a man who knew where to put numbers so they balanced. He held it, but did not hand it over, as if to show it was a record and not a weapon. "I'm not here to collect in blood," he said. There was a loan, there was a promise. The drive ended badly. A grave was dug that wasn't mine to dig, and the rest of it scattered like cattle before thunder. If I were the sort of man who counts coin above sense, I'd have sent boys. I'm not. I count men as they stand. His gaze shifted from the cowboy to the cottonwoods, then back. "You owe me, yes. But what I want is to know whether you intend to make the owing mean something besides running." The cowboy's jaw tightened, then eased, and in that motion she read the whole of what he wanted to say. "I ran from a place, not from my word." He stepped a little nearer, careful to keep the distance respectful. "I intend to pay," he said, "not with stolen money, not by rolling dice with teeth, with work, with hours that hold." "What's your name to this claim?" the foreman asked. The cowboy spoke it, the full one he rarely used, and the foreman's mouth softened almost imperceptibly, as if the sound matched an entry in a ledger and an impression in his memory. "I recall a brother rode with you," he said. "Quieter than you, if that can be believed. Good with skittish cows. He had a way of looking up at weather like it was a language he could read." "He did," the cowboy answered, and his voice carried both pride and a sorrow that was no longer raw, just faithful. The foreman nodded. "Then he counts here too." He unfolded the paper. "This is what the owing was. This is what interest does when it eats too long. This is what I can cross out if I count the grave in the balance." He made a small mark, then a larger one with the edge of his thumb, as if to smear the notion of penalty. "Leaves this," he said, tapping the lower sum. "I'll take it in seasons, not in dollars. A man can pay with a harvest and a winter's worth of mending more honestly than he can pay with coins that cost him his soul." The cowboy looked from the paper to the foreman and then to her. He did not ask for her permission. What they had agreed between them made that unnecessary, but he sought her eyes as if to steady himself inside the choice. She stepped closer, enough that the scent of the cottonwoods wrapped both their shoulders, and said, "We keep a ledger on our table too. It's written in hours and fences and nights slept through. We'll pay from there." Something like relief and something like respect passed across the foreman's face. "You bring a good partner to this," he said to the cowboy. "That mends more than posts." It was then the sound of 2 sets of hooves came from the low draw to the left, fast at first, then slowed when their riders saw how the 3 stood, not in opposition, but in the peculiar triangle of men and a woman agreeing in public. 2 young hands rode up, their hats trying too hard to be straight, the bluster of youth making noise where honor would have made quiet. One opened his mouth, saw the foreman's glance, sharp, small, sufficient, and closed it again. They dismounted, hovered, did not swagger. She felt the old fear rise. Boys became men, and men became threats too easily. But she watched it dissolve against the plain order of the moment. The foreman had arrived alone in spirit, even if not in fact. "Fetch a sack of nails from the barn," he told one of them. "If a man's to pay me in seasons, I prefer the season to start today." The boy blinked, surprised at the errands he had just been made the author of, then did as told. The other hovered a moment longer, captured by curiosity. He glanced at her, unsure whether to look full on at a woman whose story had already been misshelved in his mind. She met his gaze squarely until he remembered his manners and tipped his hat. A boy, then, not yet a man who would bruise the world to prove a point. She let a small breath out. They made terms there, under the cottonwoods, with dust shifting like pale smoke in the sunlight and the air smelling of river that rarely ran. The foreman offered work that wasn't a snare, fixing a windmill 3 miles north where the wheel cried like a lonely thing, setting deeper posts along the east pasture where the ground turned to sugar after rain, riding brakes after storm, not for show, but to make sure every living thing was accounted for. 2 months, he said. Bring me work I can count with my hands. The ledger will shrink. Come the first frost, we will speak again. If honor still sits at this table, I expect the line to be thin enough to burn off with a match. 2 months, the cowboy agreed. I'll not be missed at home, he added, and then looked at her to correct himself. Not because he feared her offense, but because truth had started to matter more than habit. I will be missed, he said softly, but we'll make the missing mean something. The foreman's eye caught the correction and held it like a man appreciates a good knot. You ride back with her, he said. Begin tomorrow. I'll send word to the livery to make sure your hours count twice when rain makes the roads mean. He turned to her. There'll be boys who think a woman alone is a gate left unlatched. Send for me if trouble comes. I've no liking for boys who think manhood is measured by noise. She nodded her thanks. It was not the promise of protection she heard, she would lean lightly on that, but the willingness to be counted among those who would stand up in daylight. That was worth something. They rode back slower than they had come, not because the path had grown longer, but because a weight had been shifted from their shoulders to their hands. Work would carry it now, not fear. He broke the quiet once, almost sheepish. I could have been angrier, he said, as if apologizing for the absence of fire. She considered that and shook her head. There are whole lives that burn without ever giving heat, she said. I prefer a hearth. Near home, they stopped by the wash where she'd once found mint with her mother. A bright edge of green still clung to shadowed soil. He crouched and pinched a leaf, held it near his face, like a man memorizing a star. Smell that? He whispered, and she did. Clean, familiar, a small brightening at the back of the throat that felt like a new promise of breath. She tucked a sprig into her bodice, a secret perfume that would last the ride. At the porch, she laid the foreman's terms on the table and weighed them against the other ledger spread open there. Jars labelled in her neat hand, a coil of rope, a scatter of eggs like smooth stones in a basket. The accounts were not the same kind, but they spoke to each other, and the net of it didn't frighten her. He would ride out at sunup. He would return by moonrise more nights than not. The fence would not fall in his absence because his hands had taught it how to stand. She would keep the house, the hens, the small economies of food and flame. He would keep the wider work, the distances where old trouble might still raise its head and be asked politely and then firmly to sit down. That evening she moved slower around the kitchen, the better to feel the shape of this new rhythm. He whittled a handle for the kettle, smoothing it so her fingers would find no splinter in the morning. "You'll be riding alone," she said at last, not to invite anxiety, but to ask for the truth they'd pledged to share. "I will," he said, "but I won't be carrying what I used to. The owing will ride with me, and the paying will ride beside it. Those two make a quieter company than regret." She poured coffee and crushed mint into his cup and then into her own. They drank in companionable quiet, the odd brightness of the herb making the bitterness kind. The light faded, the hens scolded the dark and settled. The quilt waited across the chair like a question with an answer she already knew. When they lay down that night, the room felt more spacious than its small walls should allow. She rested her palm where he had taught her it could rest, over the quiet drum of his breath, and let her own lungs answer in the same tempo. The old ghosts prowled at the edge of thought, and then wandered off, bored by the lack of spectacle. What replaced them was not spectacle, but steadiness. She slept. He did too. The lamp, turned low, held a thin halo like a halo always should, not for show, for warmth. Before dawn, she woke and rose without the old lead in her limbs. The air had a chill that meant soon the ground would harden in the mornings. She wrapped bread in cloth, set dried meat and an apple in a saddlebag, a luxury she had learned to allow when apples were offered cheap by a neighbor who hadn't the patience to dry them. She added the small blue square from the quilt scraps, rolled and tied with string. "For your pocket," she said, and when he looked puzzled she added, "So you have a corner of home when the day turns sharp." He tucked it in with care a man reserves for talismans he almost believes in. He left at first light, the horse stepping out with an eagerness that made the fence look like it wanted to follow. She watched until dust swallowed the small details that made him him. Then she watched a bit longer, a habit from long years of waiting that she allowed herself to keep. When the road settled, she turned back to the work that stitched hours together, scalding jars, feeding hens, airing the quilt, weighing flour against hunger and hope. Each task made a sound that reassured her the world had not come loose. By noon, a boy from the livery arrived with a message from the foreman, 2 lines in the same careful hand. "Hours start today. Nails sent with peat. Windmill low to the north needs a steady climber." She pinned it near the door with the scriptures and the small scraps of hymn she'd saved. The wall had begun to look like a chorus chimed from many mouths. She liked how the foreman's practical words joined the singing without offence. Late afternoon brought a wind that tried its tricks at the eaves and gave up. She let the door stand open, the better to hear hooves if they came. And they did, near dusk. The shape was familiar even before the sound was. The horse's gait, something her bones recognized. He came into the yard with dust in the crease of his smile and the smell of sun still caught in his coat. He dismounted slow in the way of men whose day has taken more from their muscles than it has from their hearts. "How does a windmill cry when it wants help?" she asked, half teasing, half hungry for the story. "Like a hungry fiddle," he said, and the laugh that followed showed her a new, easy thing she had not seen before, contentment that didn't apologize for itself. He pulled the blue scrap from his pocket and set it on the table as if he were returning a coin he meant to keep exchanging. "It helped," he said, "more than once." They ate simply, bread, beans folded with a pinch of herbs, the apple split between them, because sweetness is sweeter when cut and shared. He told her about the wind through the wheel, about the nails from peat rattling in his pocket, like small promises, about the foreman riding out to watch the day from a distance that meant trust. She told him about the hens' insistence on arguing with their own shadows, and about the neighbour's bread left discreetly on the step, wrapped in a cloth, with a note that said nothing, because some kindness lives better without words. When darkness came, it entered the room as a friendly guest. He leaned the rifle where it had learned to rest, not as a threat, but as a tool that knew its place. She smoothed the quilt and found the spot where his crooked stitch had always made her smile. Outside, coyotes discussed the moon and decided to sing less loudly tonight. The lamp settled into its glow. She thought of the cottonwoods, how they had held their leaves longer than expected, and understood that some things choose their season with a wisdom older than calendars. He would ride out again in the morning. The ledger would thin. The word honor would keep its weight. And between those errands of daylight, a home was learning to go on breathing, slow, warm, steady, long after fear had found better places to haunt. In the quiet that followed, she felt the next day begin to gather itself like a shawl laid over the shoulders. There would be surprises still and reckonings yet to meet, but the shape of their life had taken on a kindness that could withstand them. The path forward did not glitter. It gleamed the way well-used wood gleams, oiled by touch, smoothed by the here and here and here of daily hands. And in that glimmer she saw the outline of what was coming, not the end of trouble, but the companionship that makes any trouble bearable, the gentle widening of a love that had learned to speak without shouting, to hold without hurting, to heal without haste. Autumn leaned in with a gentler hand than the years before, and the valley answered with small kindnesses, a later frost, a sun that warmed without biting, a wind that chose to speak in murmurs instead of long, hard arguments at the eaves. He rode out at first light and came home under skies washed in rose and copper. She kept the centre warm, the kettle, the lamp, the little ledger on the table where hours and eggs and nails made their quiet agreements. With each day that passed, the distance between your work and mine thinned until the words no longer mattered. There was only the work that steadied them both, the slow accretion of care. He had taken to leaving a sign when he rode farther than usual, a little notch at the edge of the fence post nearest the road, cut with the tip of his knife, no taller than the width of a thumbnail. She could find it with one touch in the dark, and when her fingers traced it, she felt the calm of a vow, no spectacle, no noise, only the soft strength of a promise kept in wood. On the days when the notch sat new and shy, the hens received extra grain, and the floor was swept twice. Motion quieted the mind until hooves returned. When he came back late from the windmill 2 valleys over, she met him on the porch with a towel warmed by the stove and a basin waiting. He laughed softly at the fuss, and then let himself be tended, the way a man does when he finally understands that tenderness is not a debt, but a gift. The foreman's ledger began to thin the way ice thins beneath a kind sun. "Honor holds," his next note said in its careful hand, and they pinned it beside the scriptures and the hymn fragments, the wall by the door, a small steady choir. The town felt this shift without words. The livery boy, braver now, started practicing his reading at their table when errands brought him near. She pointed at letters with the stub of a pencil, while the cowboy corrected a halter with hands that could be both firm and gentle. The saloon kept its gossip, but changed its temperature. Speculation cooled into indifference. Indifference warmed into a rough acknowledgment. Even indifference, when it ceases to sneer, can be a mercy. One afternoon, she found a crate on the step wrapped in sackcloth, a few apples, a twist of coarse sugar, and a note from the storekeeper's wife written in a hand that trembled with effort. "Too many this week," it said, which was a lie told for kindness. She smiled into the shawl at her throat and tucked the sugar into a jar labelled like a treasure. That night they made a syrup so thin it should not have deserved the name, and yet, poured over hot cornbread, it tasted like a festival. He took a bite, closed his eyes, and shook his head with wonder at the way small sweetness can unbutton a day's fatigue. In the quiet that followed, he reached into his pocket and drew out the blue scrap she'd given him. It had softened with travel, the edges furled like petals. He set it on the table as he always did, as if returning a coin he was grateful to keep in circulation. She pressed it flat with her palm and felt beneath fabric and wood the pulse of their life. Stronger now, more certain, the way a river learns its course and stops apologizing for where it goes. They began to speak more easily about the past, not to reopen wounds, but to keep them from ruling the room. He told her how his brother once laughed so hard at a joke nobody else heard that the horses shied and then settled, curious about joy. She told him how her mother's hands smelled of soap and mint and flour, and how she had taught her that bread is not simply baked, it is believed into being. Later, when dough rose beneath a cloth like a steadying breath, he placed his hand above it, not touching, as if blessing the small miracle of yeast and patience. His palm hovered there long enough for his eyes to soften. When he looked up, she saw the man he had been before dust and debt, and also the man he had become because of them. There was love in that recognizing, not the kind that shouts its name from rooftops, but the kind that stacks wood straight, that washes bowls without being asked, that remembers where the other keeps the needle and thread. The work for the foreman grew harder as the weeks stretched. East posts where soil turned treacherous after rain, a windmill with a ladder that sang of splinters, a break in the fence line that drew hungry coyotes like a rumor draws a crowd. He came home one evening with a bruise the color of dusk along his ribs and a look that said the story was better told by touch. She set the lamp higher, sat him on the chair that creaked only for him, and worked the salve into skin with movements learned in the school of long days. "Tell me where it hurts," she said, but her hands found it first, the tender place where muscle had tightened against a fall, the little cut that would rather be held than bandaged. He breathed into her palms. The room changed shape around that breath, expanding, accepting, making room for relief. Healing was a verb they kept conjugating together. I heal, you heal, we heal. When the first frost finally came, it did not arrive like a thief, but like a quiet official, laying a fine signature across the grass and stepping back to admire his work. She woke to it and went out with her boots unlaced, breath white, and shapes of their life crisp-edged in the dawn. The quilt, hung the night before against the cold, had stiffened into a modest flag. She took it down and folded it along its seams. "We've made something," she whispered, not to boast, but to state a fact that deserved its own air. Inside, he poured coffee, added mint out of habit now, one leaf, then another, and passed her the cup with that small nod that had become his morning benediction. They rode into town that afternoon for oil, twine, a length of canvas, the ledger tucked under her arm not as armor, but as a map. The foreman met them near the edge of the road, where the cottonwoods once witnessed hard speech turned into a softer contract. He handed over a paper with the last line crossed so cleanly it looked as if it had never been written. "Paid," he said, simple as a period. The cowboy's shoulders dropped in a way they hadn't even when he slept, and she felt the echo of that release move through her body like warmth. The foreman turned to her then, slower, more formal. "You've been part of this paying," he said. "Honor's a two-handed tool." She inclined her head and let the words settle where gratitude keeps its chair. On their way back, they cut across the wash and found a cluster of willow cuttings the flood had delivered. He chose 3, straight and willing, and lashed them to the saddle. At home, he planted them along the south side, where noon threw its hardest light. "Shade for next summer," he said. "A promise we can sit under." She watered the sticks as if they were already trees, whispering a benediction learned from her mother's hands. "Grow, and be kind." That night, the stove gave off a sweeter heat, or perhaps it was only the knowledge of the paid paper singing in the drawer. They ate the last jar of summer peaches, thin slices floating in syrup like small suns found again. She told him she wanted to stitch new curtains from flour sacks printed with faded roses. He said he'd plane the sash where it stuck in the humid days, so the window would slide like a good violin bow, steady, true, no snag. They made their plans aloud the way one hangs laundry, simple, necessary, a public declaration that life continues and deserves clean air. A wind came down from the ridge after midnight, not fierce, not timid, as if testing the house for old weaknesses and finding none that mattered. She stirred and felt his arm tighten around her waist in that unthinking, faithful way that says, "I know you even in sleep." He murmured her name, only the one he used in the privacy of lamplight, softened at the edges, and she answered not with speech, but with the way her back fit his chest, as if they'd been whittled toward this curve and counter-curve all their lives. The wind took the hint and passed on. Morning brought a letter, rare as rain in high summer. The boy from the livery arrived with it folded in a careful square, his face bright with the importance of being messenger. The stamp wore a city's name they had both left behind long ago. Inside, a neat hand, a woman's, she guessed by the precise loops, asked whether the cabin still stood, whether the woman who once washed clothes for $1 a week still kept a pot of beans on a back burner for anyone honest enough to be hungry, whether a man who had run from debt had found the courage to stand for something besides himself. The letter did not pry. It extended a bridge. "If you ride as far as the old mission by Christmas," it ended, "you'll find a pew with your names carved long ago. Come sit and see if it still fits." They read it twice, and then a third time when the kettle hissed, as if to insist upon ritual. The mission lay beyond 2 ridges and a river that ran shallow most winters. The journey would be cold and bone-honest. It would ask the horses for patience and their bodies for endurance. It would ask their hearts whether home was a fixed point on a map or a moving warmth carried between 2 people. He looked at her, not as a man asking permission, but as a man measuring a horizon with the person who would ride beside him. "We could go," he said. "We could not." She set the letter on the table and smoothed it with the flat of her hand. "The pew will keep whether we sit in it or not," she said. "The question is whether our sitting there says something we need to hear." He smiled, small and true. What would it say? "That we did not just survive," she answered. "That we chose our life out loud." He nodded, as if the words had found a good home inside him. They began to plan without rush. Oats enough for the ride, a blanket heavier than the quilt, a tin of salve for wind-chapped knuckles, a ribbon for her hair, an extravagance so modest it felt like wealth. He would finish the last day's work on the windmill. She would show the neighbor boy how to feed the hens without being pecked into retreat. They would leave a note for the foreman in the same careful hand he used, so that kindness would recognize itself on the page. That afternoon they walked the fence line, as they always did, the ritual that sealed their days. The sun hung low, a coin paid slowly into the slot of evening. At the far corner post, the one he had set deeper than any other, she stopped and rested her palm against the wood. "This held," she said. He placed his hand over hers, and together they felt the post's quiet pride. "It will hold when we ride out," he said. "It will hold when we ride back." The sky went on deepening, and they turned toward the house that had learned their names from the inside out. He lifted the latch, his latch, her latch, theirs, and the door swung to greet them with the soft confidence of hinges well tended. Inside, the lamp caught, and the room gathered itself around the light, every familiar thing stepping forward to be counted. She set the letter under the lamp, and its shadow edged a little toward the future. He took the blue scrap from his pocket and laid it on the table, and its color looked like a bright, modest piece of sky they had been careful enough to save. They ate in the ease of people who have earned their appetite. The bread broke cleanly. The butter's small luxury melted into gratitude. He told her about a falcon he'd seen riding an updraft with wolfish grace. She told him about a phrase in the primer the livery boy couldn't pronounce, but wouldn't give up on. Steadfast. They said it together, testing the weight of its consonants, liking how it anchored the mouth. Steadfast, he repeated, and the lamp seemed to agree, its flame holding steady in the small breath of the room. When they lay down, the decision had not been carved, but the wood had been chosen, the grain admired, the tools laid out. They would sleep on it, because sleep, like yeast, like forgiveness, does the work no waking can do. She pulled the quilt up, finding the patch where his first clumsy stitch ran a little wild. She pressed her thumb there. He kissed the crown of her head where the day's dust still hinted of willow and mint. Outside, the valley listened for its own reasons and then relaxed. Inside, their breathing braided. The night held them without questioning. And in that holding, the next chapter loosened from the horizon, shimmering not with spectacle, but with promise. A road dusted with frost, a pew with their names hidden like initials in the bark of a tree. A return to a house that had learned the art of welcome, and between all of it, the quiet, durable joy of two people who had chosen to keep choosing. The kind of love that doesn't hurry, doesn't threaten, doesn't demand, but keeps a lamp lit and a seat warm, knowing that every journey worth taking leads you back to the home you build in one another. Winter pressed its hand across the valley, not cruelly, but firmly enough to remind every living thing that endurance was a language all its own. The frost clung white along the fence rails he had set, and the windows carried soft lacework of ice that the morning lamp turned to fragile silver. Their cabin, once a place of thin walls and emptiness, now held warmth like a living heart. Every board bore the proof of work shared, of care laid down day after day, until the house was not merely shelter, but testament. She woke early to stir the fire, and when he stepped inside from the cold yard, shaking snow from his coat, the room filled with something more precious than heat. The quiet knowledge that they were no longer two strangers circling their griefs, but two souls who had chosen steadily to hold one another against the long winter nights. The journey to the mission had been made when the frost was at its deepest. Together they had crossed the river where ice rimmed the shallows, their breath rising in white clouds, their horses steady with trust. They had found the old pew, the wood marked faintly with names carved by younger hands, and they had sat shoulder to shoulder, listening not for sermons, but for the truth that silence sometimes speaks more clearly than voices. She had rested her palm on the carved letters and felt the warmth of his hand covering hers, sealing the moment as though the wood itself had agreed to remember them. It was not ceremony they sought. It was confirmation that they had lived past survival into something worth calling love. The ride home had been cold, but it had been filled with laughter too, the kind that rose unforced, like fire catching on kindling. Back in the valley, the days folded into a rhythm deeper than routine. She sewed new curtains from flour sacks stamped with roses, and when the wind pressed them against the glass, the cabin seemed to bloom with a softness she had once believed lost. He carved a cradle from spare wood, not because a child was promised yet, but because hope asked to be given shape. They both tended the willow shoots that had taken root by the south wall, whispering encouragement to their thin branches. Healing came not in a rush, but in these slow, tender tasks, an apple sliced in half so sweetness could be shared, a wound washed with care, a laugh that lingered into the quiet. Even the hens seemed to sense it, clucking contentedly as if they, too, had found peace in the steadiness of lives rebuilt. At night, under the quilt patched with both their hands, they spoke of futures without fear. The talk was simple: fields to plant come spring, fences to strengthen, neighbors to thank. But beneath each word lay the greater vow that neither of them would face another season alone. She no longer braced herself for footsteps outside her door. Instead, she listened for the steady rhythm of his breathing, the sound that told her the night was safe. He no longer carried silence as a shield. Now it was a language of presence, of comfort, of love that did not need to shout to be believed. And in the hush between words, they felt whole. The cabin stood, strong against the wind. The debts were gone. The false claims burned to ash. The storms endured. What remained was something deeper than survival. A partnership that had turned loneliness into belonging, suspicion into trust, and weariness into warmth. Their scars had not vanished, but they had softened, woven into a story that no longer spoke of endings, but of beginnings. Two lives once broken had been stitched into one, the seam visible but beautiful for its honesty. This was love, not as a sudden fire, but as a steady flame, healing, enduring, alive. And if this story has touched something inside you, if it has offered warmth, or stirred a quiet hope, or reminded you that even in the harshest places love can take root, I invite you to share your heart in the comments below. Leave your thoughts. Let them breathe here. A simple like, a quiet subscription, or a word of encouragement is more than support. It is the kind of light that keeps stories like this alive, carrying warmth into other lonely nights. Your presence here matters just as theirs did for one another. So stay, share, and let us continue building a place of love together.